So this is a 30-minute sequence using the wall to work with the legs and the lower body. So when we're sitting and we roll through postures like Upavishtakonasana, Baddha Konasana, Dandasana, those can be a big ask on the hips. And if you're not flexible, they really are quite a bit of work. Now, this sequence, we're going to take a few of those familiar postures and put them at the wall. And I'm not saying they're not going to be work, but they're going to be work in a different way. Before we get started, I want you to make an honest assessment of your mobility around your lumbar and your pelvis, your hip sockets, and in regards to your hamstrings. So in those areas, I'm pretty mobile. So when I set this up for myself, I'm not going to use the prop that I suggest for folks who are not as mobile. Let me show you what all this is meaning so that you can make a couple of wise selections. So through this sequence, we're going to come into a premise of having the legs up the wall. So Viparita Karani, if you know it that way. So I'll start by side lying, kind of tucked up into a fetal position, and then I'm going to do my big roll, and I'll move in a little bit once or twice to get myself here. So as I come to this, I have very little space between my backside and this baseboard. I'm pretty much right up against it, just a little bit of clearance. And when I'm there, I'm not forced to tuck my tailbone or to bend my knees. So my hips don't have to lift off the floor with a flexed low back and a bent pair of legs, because as I mentioned, this is an area of where I have a fair amount of mobility. However, if that describes you, that when you're close to the wall, you have to roll your tailbone towards the ceiling, flatten your back, let the knees buckle a little bit here, then I want you to use a particular prop and greater distance away from the wall. So the assessment could be here, can I come to my legs up the wall and have a pretty neutral pelvis? I'm actually just going to shimmy out a little bit. So I have probably between the back of my seat and the wall, like maybe an inch or two of space. It's pretty close to it. And when I'm here, I can get my tailbone to drop and put myself to a neutral pelvis. The other check-in is we don't want those ribs flying off the floor when that happens. So pretty neutral pelvis, as close as I'll think I'll get in this position. So that's going to be fine for me to go without the use of a prop. But I did scoot away a little bit to make it all accessible. Now, if that's really difficult for you to come up with, what I'd like you to do is to take a blanket opened once from its storage fold and then fold it into thirds. And this can be a little fussy for the rolling in part, but I know with a little perseverance, you'll get there. And you're going to have the end of it a few more inches away from the wall. So enough room so that your backside can sit there, but then not so close to the wall that when you're there, that the bottoms of your cheeks are pretty much on the wall. So what I'm going to do is, again, kind of tuck into that fetal position. I'm going to have the end of the blanket about in line with my butt as I'm in the sideways position. And then I'm going to roll up the wall. There's greater distance between the back of my seat and the wall. And that what I want for anybody who's going to be using this is that you are positioning this so that your tailbone falls forward towards the floor. So this is to antrovert, to roll your pelvis forward. So for the tighter folks, you'll do wonderfully well. More distance between your butt and the wall, and then the blanket tip to the side. So maybe that will show you a little bit better. I have this end of the blanket kind of going across mid sacrum, upper sacrum, so that when I come over this, my tailbone falls to the floor. That's your setup. If you are stiffer around the hips and legs, I want us to be able to get into a neutral pelvic position while we do this. So I'm going to ditch that, move that out of the way, and I'm going to come back in. I know my end point, I'll be just an inch or two away from the wall. How'd I do? Not too bad. And we're going to start with our legs up the wall, knees straight, and then set your legs to your pelvic width distance apart. We're going to be watching our legs through a lot of this. So if you wanted to slide your hands to the back of your head and do like that little itty bitty sit up, you could be there. If you wanted to slide a blanket there for a little bit of lift, if otherwise it feels straining to your throat or to your eyes to look up at your legs. While we start with this, the legs that are pelvic width distance, do you have a matching pair or does the pose combined with your particular areas of tension, does this sort of pull one knee to turn out or turn a foot around? And as you have this for a few moments, could you make any micro adjustments to create the appearance of a more symmetrical pair of legs, even if in reality you're doing 73 times the amount of work on one leg than the other? And again, with this, it's going to be tempting as we're here for some of us to tuck the tailbone to be in the sequence, but I'd really love for us to look for that neutral pelvic position, which makes this the sort of analog of the seated versions. All right, so we're going to come back to this a couple of times. We'll call it our baseline pose. It's like a dandasana with the legs up the wall. Let's visit Upavishta Konasana. So I'm going to suggest that you put your legs in your line of sight, and as they move apart, already from the get-go, I wasn't about to do the thing I wanted to say. You're going to move them apart equally. My one stretchier leg went out. As soon as it heard that, it like jumped the gun. We're going to move the feet apart equally or at the same time, going the same distance. Now, wide angle is what we call Upavishta Konasana. And note that we don't call it the widest angle pose. So you might know that you could go out a couple more inches. Yeah, but then it's like, it's dicey. I don't think I can drop my tailbone down. I'll probably hold my breath. I bet I'd even like brace myself with my elbows on the floor. So I'm gonna bring it in a couple inches. And I know I'm not at this maxed out position of range, right? While you're here, can you again come to that dropping the tailbone against the floor and then just monitor for yourself, are you lifting the ribs in order to do that? Can you keep the rib cage nestled against the floor? I'm gonna give this a few more breaths. And though I gave you the sort of baseline parameter for when and how you'd use a prop, you can try the prop even if you don't feel like you fell into the category of requiring it. And every once in a while, I always suggest be a rule breaker. If I told you exactly what I'd expect out of your practice with these parameters, you can always try it without those things. Okay, same thought. Can you bring your legs towards each other? Same rate on both legs, so one isn't coming in much faster. That's hard to do. And then let the legs, again, just come back to that baseline, hips width distance. We'll call it like an inverted dandasana. And I'm giving them a scan. I'm gonna notice, I notice one leg tends to fall out wider, so I'm just gonna bring that in an inch. Does one leg look longer? Could you stretch the shorter appearing side up higher? And again, what about rotation, or does the ankle kind of try to cover up something that's higher up at the knee or hip? And can you drop your tailbone down as opposed to doing all of these with the tailbone tucking? Well, what about Baddha Konasana? Let's give a look at that. So this does not require the same huge stretch of the inner thighs and hamstrings. So it's a little bit different, though we do stretch those adductors. Soles of the feet come together, and then you're going to slide those heels down the wall. Where can you put this pose without the knees swinging forward towards you? So not with the hands at the moment, but just off of the strength of your hips themselves. Can you pull the knees towards the wall? Can you keep those inner big toe mounds sealed together, inner heels sealed together, and roll your tailbone down towards the floor so that you don't end up flexing the low back? And I'm actually going to pick up my head for this one because this pose really displays some of my asymmetry, and I'm just going to think about getting that right thigh to open a little bit more, and then head comes back. All right, let's go back to that hips width distance Dandasana up the wall. And again, scanning, looking. It'd be interesting to note if through this sequence, you could notice any distinct change in this baseline read of the pose. All right, so what about a modified squat? So you're going to bend your knees again. This time, instead of the feet coming together, the feet will stay on the wall. And let's do this one two ways. So firstly, drop your heels as low as you can and let the tailbone tuck on this one, because it's useful for this particular pose. And as you're here for the moment, you might find, like I do, that like the base of my glutes, most of my butt is not on the floor, and I'm flexing my low back. So my low back is pressing down. 'Tis not a harmful thing, just does not tend to be the preference for many reasons in yoga asana. But here we are in a modified squat and with that tailbone tuck. Then can you undo it? Can you keep your feet in the same position and roll your tailbone back towards the floor? Close but no cigar. So I'm going to scooch my feet back up a couple inches. Yeah. And there I can complete that pelvic action. So here my hips aren't as lifted off of the ground. And go back and forth between tucking the tailbone and then dropping the tailbone. So essentially you're doing like a cat and cow, as we nickname those motions, but you're doing it while in a reclining legs up the wall squat. This is a great pose for any folks who are watching this who are also yoga teachers who value this range of motion, knee flexion, hip flexion, but would hesitate to teach a deep squat malasana to their particular demographic of students. Here you can still get some range. It's passive mostly, but it's a good way for people to kind of explore what they actually have for that knee and hip flexion. All right, let's end on that note of dropping the tailbone down. And then from there, let's reach the legs back up the wall, our baseline Dandasana, scanning for symmetry, those familiar quirks through the legs. All right, let's cycle through those 3 or 4 a couple more times. Let's go back to wide angle. Again, it's not the widest. If you want to go to your end range of motion for the moment, you're welcome to it, but you got to get out of it, right? So what's the point of letting those legs fall so far over that you then have to use a hand to move them? So maybe for just a couple of breaths, indulge for all the stretchy people, the greatest range of motion, and then bring it in a little bit. Okay, do a little bit of geometry, see where this angle is currently. Remember what it looks like when your legs are back up, and cut that in half, come halfway up and hold here. Drop the tailbone down, ribs settle to the floor, so no arching here. And then we'll bring the legs back in towards each other. Here one more time, that Dandasana. Let's go back to Baddha Konasana, soles of the feet together, and then sliding the heels down. Lower the tailbone to the floor. On this one, non-aggressively, please, but you could place your palms somewhere along the inner thighs towards the inner knees and gently press those knees towards the wall. I hesitate even to offer this version because I'm remembering from days gone past, like the person who really wants their hips open and they think manual assistance going to cover ground. And it doesn't really. What you're really doing is just figuring out your passive range of motion. And so I am putting like a light touch, my friends, and just gently guiding my knees towards the wall. So don't be the aggressive yogi fool who feels like, oh, if I could just get in there with a jackhammer, this would really improve things. It just doesn't work that way, not at all. And then once you have your hands here and you've sort of said to your knees, hey, I'm giving you a gentle suggestion, push towards the wall. Well, now push your knees back into your hands. It's a little isometric. So my hands are pressing to my knees, but then my knees say, not so fast. And they press equally back into the hands. Oh, it whips up a flurry of muscle contraction. All right, cease and desist from that little tug of war. And from here, we'll bring the knees back together. We'll slide the legs up the wall. Here's that baseline Dandasana. And then back to our reclining wall supported squat. So knees come to a bend. And then like think about your like a super wide squat, one that you might not replicate were you actually standing on your feet. So I'm going to take one foot out wider than the other, pair with that a turned out position of the toes, and get into a place again where you're not forced to tuck the tailbone and take the hips off the floor, but you're dropping your tailbone back. And again, this is a wider set, toes turned out. You know, if you saw somebody who was going to do some weightlifting, this is their squatting position. They don't do it like a yogi. It's actually very stable. So it's a nice one to visit. Tailbone down, tailbone down. All right, let's bring the feet in closer and then slide back up to that Dandasana. And we'll do one more set. We'll go more swiftly through it this time. So back to Upavishta. Find a tolerable edge, does not have to be the widest angle, but a wide one. Tailbone down, ribs snuggle to the floor. We'll give it a few breaths. This time, let's let them move independently. Left leg stays in place, right leg back. Whoa, to Dandasana. This becomes twist prevention because what wants to happen is just like, I want to fall into my plant. So as I keep my right leg up vertical, and my left leg out to the side, I want to get these right ribs down to the floor, the right side of my waist down to the floor, and the right side of my pelvis to the floor. So that means I kind of have to rein this left leg in a little bit. Otherwise, I cannot control it. I'm going to crash into my plant. All right, and then left leg comes up. Go back to a wide angle, both legs, tailbone down. Left leg up to Dandasana. And then again, it becomes a twist prevention program. The easy way out, just jab that right elbow on the floor. So let's step away from the easiest possible fix and actually get into some core strength. So tip down on that left side of the waist, pelvis, and rib cage. And what I'm finding is I have to pull this leg in a little bit. Otherwise, I cannot make that move. And that's a little bit easier. Not easy, but easier. Whoa. And then we'll bring that leg back up. Okay, Baddha Konasana, soles of the feet together, feet slide down, tailbone down, ribs nestle to the floor. And let's give this one a different twist. We'll go from Baddha Konasana to Sukhasana. So cross the right leg over the left, but just cross really at the ankles instead of trying to get the shins to cross here. So it's like a loose version of a Sukhasana. So it's asymmetrical. How did your body take that? Did you hike that right hip up towards the waist? Can you still get the knees to press apart? All right, let's uncross those ankles back to BK, Baddha Konasana. And then let's bring the left up and over the right, right behind the left. They cross centrally. And we'll think about the knees widening apart. Knees towards the wall, tailbone down, ribs nestle. That's my word of the day for the ribs. And then from here, we'll uncross back to Baddha Konasana. Last few breaths here, how low can you go with those heels, right? If you get to a point where like the heels go way lower, but then your knees fly forward and your tailbone tucks, that's not quite yours yet. So just get closer, get closer. And that's about the end of the line for me. Ooh. And then we'll go straight back up. And one last time to a squat. Let's do it single-legged at a time. So left leg stays in position. Right knee comes on down. It's sort of like a knee to chest move, yeah? So, or sort of like Ardha Appanasana. As you're here, can you roll the tailbone down? And then we'll slide that leg back up. Left knee to a bend. Heel comes down. A single-legged squat. If you were doing this in the middle of the room, we'd be all very impressed. It's called a pistol squat. Since we're lying down, we'll call it Ardha Appanasana, knee to chest pose. All right, and then let's go back up, back to our Dandasana. So let's cap off this legs up the wall sequence with what's often called Sukhi Randrasana or Eye of the Needle pose. If you weren't a yogi, you would know it just as a piriformis stretch. And even if you're flexible-ish and you've been without a blanket and you've been pretty close to the wall, you might find that as we go through this sequence, it's wise to scooch away. So ditch the ego, even if you've got flexible hamstrings, they don't help you with this one. So I'm gonna start kind of knowing where it heads for me. I'm just gonna inch away, a little inchworm movement to get off the wall. You can see now there's maybe like 6 or so inches between my backside and the baseboard. Still starting with a neutral pelvis. I'm going to cross my right ankle to my left knee, or figure 4 pose. We'll go in slowly, do it a piece at a time. So as you have this, can you think about this right knee swinging towards the wall? And let's put that as a motion a few times here. So the knee's gonna come in and swing out, in and out. And you can be kind of like lazy daisy about it and just kind of swing within your most accessible range of motion, but push a little bit past that, not because we're trying to do something extreme in the range of motion, but there's an edge of that where you just contract the side of your hip to move your femur. That's what we want. Okay, a couple more. Swinging out to use contraction, not to bust through range, but to really see that this sort of stuff is not just about mobility. It's an equal discussion between strengths and mobility. Okay, next time you have that knee pressing out, even if it looks very much like it's pointing right towards your chin, it's your version of knee pressing out, so we'll have to love it. You're going to put a bend into that left knee and drag the heel down. Now, I'm not invested in getting this left foot lower or the knee into a deeper bend, because what's already beginning to happen? I'm beginning to tuck my tailbone. So if you do this and your butt is in the air and you're standing on the crown of your head, what I'd like you to get a sense of is that you are too close to the wall for this to work. So scooch out, and or don't try to bend the knee as much, like bend it barely. Because if your hips are lifting from the floor, I know that you're just getting into what I call like stretch seduction, like you're just seeking stretch. It's fine. I think stretch has got a lot to inform us about. However, I like to work holistically. So the idea that you could stretch the bejesus out of the outside of your right hip and thigh, yet you still anchor your tailbone to the floor, that's strength and mobility, right? So I'm not so easily seduced by stretch anymore. I certainly was in the very beginning years of my yoga, because it can feel great, or it can feel like hurts so good. So instead of just going for the part where it's like everything feels like it's at maxed tension, but you have no idea what your body is doing, let's skip that version of yoga, please and thank you. And I'll tell you, I will tell you, I am working here. Oh, so I'm trying to keep my knee towards the wall. That's something. I'm trying to keep my tailbone down. That's something else. And then I'm challenging my mobility by taking this left knee into a bend, which of course brings the right shin closer towards my chest. And I think I have found, at least for the next few breaths, like this very interesting place where those things are all converging. One's not overpowering the other. And it's good. It's stretch plus, stretch plus strength. Oof, all right, let's go ahead and wind out of that one, take yourself back to that baseline Dandasana. You know, it's such a big deal pose for me that when I take my leg out, I feel like this leg's going to be 7 times longer, or like bright red with improved circulation. And it looks mostly the same. But I am finding that I can correct my tendency to roll the leg out a little bit more simply. That's nice to find. Okay, so there's side 2, you know this. Before we get there, are you tucking your tailbone? Are you standing on the crown of your head? And can you lengthen the base of the skull, the neck, and can you lengthen your tailbone towards the floor? It's not my default position. I don't think it would be anybody's with their legs up the wall. All right, so here it is. I'm going to cross my left ankle just around that right knee. And the first order of business isn't just this sort of la-di-da swing where you're kind of moving where mobility is simplest for you. You want to go past that and move where you have to recruit a fair amount of muscle. And for, you know, 99.9% of us, it's going to be on that outward movement, right? Where the knee is coming closer to the wall. When I return my leg in, it's basically just falling into gravity, into my particular lines of tension. So when I press that knee out, I'm not looking to break on through to the other side of range of motion because it's not interesting. It's not even there. What I am looking for is that pocket of muscle on the outside of that hip socket that says, oh, I have to really contract if you're going to move this knee out. So for all of us who were seduced by stretch inside of yoga, you can be forgiven for that because that's often how it was sold to us. Like you're just not flexible enough. Flexibility is sort of a useless resource unless it's paired with a good amount of strength. So as you go through this, yeah, maybe you are stretching something. Maybe your hip socket just doesn't permit that much movement, but you know what, we can all use just a little bit more tone and strength on those outer hips. All right, I'll do 1 or 2 more. On this next one, I think I'll linger. I'm gonna linger, I'll linger and I'll shake in that position where I'm pulling my knee to the wall. Okay, I'm gonna commit to this, knee moving towards wall, tailbone lowering towards the floor. And then from that, I'm going to bend, it's not by much, into my right knee. And I'm not going to fuss with keeping my toes on the wall. I'm just going to go for a heel press. And again, I want to get into this place where I'm not being, you know, sort of like a fervent adherent to alignment, as much as I am super curious about what it means to create that action. So if you want to align yourself with the word alignment, as a lot of yogis do, for the purposes of us understanding each other, in my head, that means action, not position. So you are actively dropping your tailbone down. You are actively pressing your knee towards the wall. You have actively dragged that foot down the wall, and maybe you're pushing into the wall additionally. And as you stir those things together, again, it's a convergence of a few actions. The outcome is you got to have some mobility, you got to have some strength. And if you get seduced by stretch, I hope you also get seduced by strength someday, if not today. I mean, I think it's really encouraging to know that it's not, yoga just isn't going to be easy for the people who are flexible. Strength's the great equalizer. You can make anything hard by making people work for it. All right. Oh, I'm going to stay a little bit longer, but I'm telling you, things are happening. I'm working for this. Tailbone, anchor it down. Knee, press it to the wall. You've put a bend into this formerly straight leg side. As you've pulled down, can you press that heel into the wall? Let the ribs drop back to the floor. Again, if you end up standing on the crown of your head, your neck is trying to make up for some lack of mobility further downstream. Shouldn't have to do that for you. All right, mercy. Uncle, let's go ahead and unwind from here. So right leg goes back up the wall, left leg goes back up the wall. Give yourself a few breaths in a Dandasana. Last couple of breaths here, maybe tuck the tailbone purposefully, drop the tailbone down. When you're ready to come out, You could bend into your knees the way that we got in. We reverse that. You can roll over onto your side. There's a moment where you're just sort of tucked into a fetal position. And then thereafter, you can sit yourself on up. Okay, I hope those felt really good. That's some of my favorite stuff to do. Familiar shapes, just peppered with different instruction and a different orientation to give them something new to think about. Hope you liked it.